morning. On the behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Central Procurement Entity Implementation Initiative meeting to discuss the final proposal, which was posted on February 8th. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. And I'll also be joined by Bridget Sparks from Policy and James Lynn, Senior Advisor, Market Settlement Design. The presentation and other materials related can be found on the initiative webpage. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please remember to keep comments professional and respectful. Also, please try and be brief and refrain from please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently. Next slide, please. Instructions for questions. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx. Or if you've joined via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first. You may also send your question via chat to all panelists. If you need technical assistance during today's meeting, please feel free to send the chat to the event producer. Next slide. For today's agenda, after I'm finished with the introduction, I'll turn it over to Bridget to discuss the Central Procurement Entity Implementation Proposal, followed by James to discuss the RAAIM Settlement Modification Proposal. Bridget will then discuss the EIM governing body role, and then I'll go over the next steps at the end of this meeting. Next slide. The stakeholder process. This graphic depicts the ISO stakeholder process. We are currently in the final proposal development phase of the stakeholder process, and I'll review the next steps in the process at the end of this presentation. Next slide. The policy development schedule today, February 15th, is the comment deadline on the revised draft tariff language, followed by the March 1st comment deadline on the final proposal. Then we plan to present the proposal to the Board of Governors for decision at their meeting in mid-March, with the plan for implementation in October 2022 to be in effect for RA year 2023. And from here, I will turn it over to Bridget.
Thanks, Ellie. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the final proposal. So if we go to the next slide, please, and one more. So for the final proposal, since we have presented on this a number of times, for brevity's sake, we have taken out some of the background slides that describe the local capacity requirement study process. And so we won't be going over this background information on the CPE or the LCR process. But if stakeholders are interested in that background, please see the draft final presentation or the final proposal paper, which you can find on the link attached. And also for convenience purposes and to highlight what's actually changed between the draft final and the final proposal, we have highlighted the substantive changes to the final proposal in red in both the paper as well as in this slide deck. Next slide. We also just want to take a few moments to acknowledge the alignment between the CPUC and the CAISO stakeholder process. So the impetus for this initiative was the original June 2020 decision by the CPUC that adopted the central procurement entity. And over the last few months, the CPUC has been running another proceeding to update and work on additional implementation details for the CPE. And so the CPUC published its proposed decision on that proceeding on February 10th. And are expected to release the final decision in March. So while the CAISO is moving somewhat ahead of the CPUC process, this is because in order to get the necessary tariff changes adopted by or approved by the board and adopted by FERC, and get the system implementation details worked out and implemented in advance of that October 31st showings deadline for the RA year 2023 annual process. And the CAISO's had to move a little bit ahead of where the CPUC process is at. However, in reading that proposed decision, CAISO staff feels like the final proposal works well with what is in the proposed decision. And so we think that what we have designed here, again, will work with the final CPUC order, and that we've also been designing our tariff and system changes to be compatible with that CPUC design. And so we think that moving forward, we should be okay, even if it is a little in advance of that CPUC process. Next slide. So here we go into the actual proposal for how the CAISO plans to accommodate a CPE into our tariff and systems. Next slide. So first, the CAISO proposes that the CPE will be defined as a market participant that will be represented by a scheduling coordinator, and the CPE will be subject to the scheduling coordinator ID GMC charge. A change from the draft final proposal is that the CAISO is no longer proposing a new subsection 4 in the tariff that outlines the responsibility of the CPE, and we are also no longer requiring a pro forma agreement for the creation of the CPE. In further discussions in the tariff development phase, we realized that today LSEs don't have to have a pro forma agreement, but everything is done through a scheduling coordinator. So because the CPE, again, is just a procurement entity, we think that its operation through a scheduling coordinator is sufficient and we don't need a new pro forma. And then we've also, again, taken out the proposed language in the subsection 4.18 based on stakeholder feedback. Next slide. The CPE will be responsible for submitting annual and monthly RA plans to the CAISO following existing RA plan submission timelines. The CPE will be subject to late or missing submission penalties. And although the CPUC ordered a multi-year procurement for the local RA, the CAISO will maintain its annual showings process at this time. And so the CPE should plan to make annual showings with the CAISO. Next slide. And so this is a new addition to our proposal. It was pointed out in the tariff call that today the CAISO has existing tariff language in section 40.3.3 that states that scheduling coordinators for load-serving entities may aggregate responsibilities for procurement of local capacity area resources. And so because the CPE serves this aggregation function, CAISO has determined that it could cause confusion to implement the formal CPE structure approach while also maintaining this parallel informal aggregation opportunity. And so in light of that, and with the adoption of this CPE, we are proposing to remove this language from the tariff and to have all of the aggregating be done through the formal CPE. Next slide. So for CPUC jurisdictional LSEs, the CAISO will continue to calculate the total local capacity area RA resource obligations of CPUC jurisdictional LSEs and give these to the CPUC. The CPUC may then allocate these local RA obligations to its LSEs using its own methodology. And if the CPUC does not allocate the total sum, the CAISO will continue to allocate any remaining local obligation to the relevant LSEs using the default methodology outlined in section 40.3.2. And so in order to accommodate the CPE, the CAISO proposes to modify tariff section 40.3.2a to allow an LSE or a CPE to be assigned a local RA obligation. So under the PD, the Commission is still electing to give the entire local responsibility to the CPE, And so this tariff language will accommodate that, as well as still leave the option open for LSCs to carry this obligation should the Commission tweak the program in the future. Next slide. For non-CPSC jurisdictional entities, we will continue to assign a local obligation using the allocation method described in section 40.3.2a. And so the CAISO will still directly assign the local obligation to individual LSCs of non-CPSC jurisdictional entities. However, we proposed to add an additional opportunity in which LRAs may choose to shift all or part of their LSC's local RA obligation to the CPE. So again, the CAISO will first assign the obligation to the individual LSCs and then provide an opportunity in the annual time space for an LRA to designate a CPE and shift that obligation to the CPE. In recognition of the fact that LRAs beyond the CPUC tend to represent smaller entities and may only represent a single LSC, we felt it was prudent to allow multiple LRAs to utilize and designate the same CPE in recognition of the fact that non-CPUC LRAs tend to be smaller and, again, only represent one entity. And so they, by default, are a simple procurement entity. And so in order to provide them the same central buyer advantages that the Commission is trying to develop with their CPE program, again, the CAISO is going to allow multiple LRAs to utilize and designate the same CPE. Next slide. So stakeholder comments from the draft final proposal, all commenting parties, including Cal CCA, CDWR, Middle River Power, PG&E, and SCE, continue to be generally supportive of the CAISO's efforts to recognize and incorporate the CPE into its tariff systems. PG&E and SCE question the need for a pro forma agreement, which the CAISO agrees with and has changed its proposal to remove the pro forma agreement. Middle River Power, PG&E, and SCE submitted comments critiquing the CAISO's proposed tariff language in Section 4, and the CAISO has since removed its proposed Section 4.18 from the revised draft tariff language, and so these comments are no longer relevant. So with that, I'll pause to see if there are any questions.
There are currently no questions in queue, but as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, to ask the question via WebEx audio, please press the raise hand icon on your WebEx screen that's located above the chat panel to place yourself in the question queue. And if you're connected via regular phone audio, pressing #2 will enter you into the question queue. All right, I do not see any questions in queue.
Great, thank you. Okay, next slide. So section 40.2.3a states that an LSC will not be assigned a local obligation in excess of their system obligation for the applicable month. Since the CPE is a procurement entity and does not have a load share ratio, it will not be subject to this provision. And so the CPE will have no capping placed on a local obligation, and it can be the full assignment by either the LRA or the CAISO. The CAISO proposes to exempt LSCs without a load share in a TAC area from this provision of the tariff and develop software enhancements to support this exemption. If not exempt, an entity's local obligation would be capped at 0 megawatts and thus would not be committed to show capacity to meet its assigned local obligation. Next slide. So these next two slides describe a tangential but related issue that was brought to our attention by a stakeholder. And so for LSCs that serve load in multiple TAC areas, they will be allocated a local obligation in each TAC area. And under the existing tariff provision, these local obligations would be capped at their entire system obligation. And this could lead to a higher local CCM cost allocation as compared to an LSC with load in a single tax area. Next slide. So in order to provide parity between LOCs with load in a single tax area and those with load in multiple tax areas, we are proposing to modify section 40.3.2a and develop software enhancements to allow for LOCs with load in multiple tax areas to be capped at an LOC's local obligation at their applicable demand reserve margin requirements in each tax area for the applicable month. So again, rather than capping the local obligation at the LOC's system obligation in all tax areas, the capping will be done on a tax-by-tax basis. This should reduce the local CCM cost allocation to be on par with LOCs who have load in a single tax area. So again, the point of this provision is, again, to provide parity between LOCs with load in multiple tax areas with the current tariff provisions for those that have load in a single tax area. Next slide. So stakeholder comments were generally supportive of this. CalCCA did not oppose this proposal, and PG&E supported it. SCE was also generally supportive of this proposal, but commented that LOCs that self-share resources outside their tax area should not be assigned any local obligation. Again, the CAISO will continue to defer to the CPUC on local RA obligation assignment, and so it's up to the Commission to decide how they want to treat entities that agree to self-show resources outside of the tax area that they serve load in. SCE asked for further clarification regarding the history and purpose of the existing tariff section 40.3.2a that caps an LOC's local obligation at their system obligation. And on the next slide, we go into a little bit more of this history. Next slide. So CDWR requested that the CAISO modify its proposal to cap an LOC's local obligation at their system obligation in both the annual and monthly time frame. So again, currently the provision only applies to the monthly time frame, and in the annual time space, the CAISO does not cap a local obligation at an entity's system obligation. And so the CAISO does not support CDWR's request for expansion of this tariff provision, which is intended to make LOCs with load in multiple tax areas on par with LOCs in a single tax area and views it as outside the scope of this initiative. The CAISO believes that this request is detrimental to the local RA program, which was designed from the beginning with the intention of eliminating the year-long RMR contract. The local RA is an annual requirement, and LOCs must show contracted capacity for each month in the annual time frame to meet this requirement. When in RSI 2, I believe the CAISO offered the current policy as a compromise. CAISO agreed to a proposal made by the SDG&E to cap local at system in the monthly time frame to provide additional capacity that can be used for substitution. And so under the local RA program, all LLCs are required to contract for the full capacity amount identified in the studies in the annual time space. But then as we move into the monthly process, to the extent that an entity's system requirement is lower than what their local obligation was for that month, the CAISO agreed to cap it, which would allow LLCs additional resources that could be used to substitute for planned or forced outages as a compromise. But again, since local RA is an annual program, CDWR's request to cap the annual at the system obligation would be detrimental to that program and would move the need to procure those resources onto other entities. And so again, we think it's fair to maintain the current policy, but again, we're offering this policy change in the monthly time frame, again, to provide parity for LLCs with load in multiple tax areas to be on par with LLCs in a single tax area. So with that, I'll pause to see if there are any additional questions.
I do not see any questions in the queue.
Okay. Next slide, please. So the system and local attributes of RA resources cannot be unbundled. In recognition of this, the CPUC ordered the CPE to buy the bundled attributes of resources and use CAM credits to allocate the system and flex attributes of the resource to LSEs to help them meet their own system and flex RA obligation. The CAISO proposes to implement separate fields in the LRA credit templates in SIRA to accept and validate system CPE credits, similar to the existing system CAM credits that we utilize today. The CAISO will require that all CPE system credits allocated to LSEs must match the exact quantity of local RA resources shown by the CPE or that the LRA expects the CPE to show. Next slide. The CAISO currently does not have functionality to accept and validate flexible RA CAM credits, and so the CAISO proposes to build and implement separate fields in the LRA credit templates in SIRA to accept and validate the CPE flexible credits, which again are similar to the existing system credits, but would be applied to capture the flex attributes of any local resources. The CAISO will require that all flexible credits allocated to LSEs must match the exact quantity of flexible RA capacity shown by the CPE or that the LRA expects the CPE to show. Next slide. So again, stakeholders have been generally supportive of this proposal. CalCCA, PG&E, and SCE supported the CAISO's proposal. PG&E further advocated that the CAISO adopt a default allocation methodology for the system and flex credits if the LRA does not allocate the credits. However, the CAISO does not believe a default methodology is feasible because the LRA would still be a point of failure in multiple circumstances. So either the LRA has to give the CAISO the credit allocation or notify the CAISO which LSEs are represented by the CPE to apply the default allocation method to. So in earlier tariff language, the CAISO had considered requiring the CPE to notify it of the LSEs it represented. We got pushback from stakeholders on that proposal, so we have since removed it. And so again, the LRA would either have to give us the allocation methodology of these credits or notify us of which LSEs are represented by the CPE for us to apply a default methodology to. And so either way, again, that LRA is the same point of failure. And so again, we don't think that PG&E's proposal for default methodology is implementable or very practical. And so the CAISO will continue to coordinate with the LRAs to ensure that we get the credit allocations from these entities. But again, we don't think it's a big risk that LRAs would allow capacity to be stranded and unallocated. Next slide. So this next section outlines clarification of the CPM process and cost allocations and how the CPE will fit into those existing processes. So the CAISO proposes to modify the tariff to apply the existing capacity procurement mechanism or CPM process and cost allocation methodologies to a CPE as outlined in tariff section 43A. While the CAISO expects minor changes to this tariff section to recognize the CPE in these processes, CAISO will need to update its settlement system to be able to allocate costs to a CPE in addition to individual LSEs in each tax area. Next slide. So using the existing process, after the annual and monthly showing deadline, the CAISO will look at the entire portfolio of shown RA resources to validate that the procured portfolio satisfies the capacity and energy requirements identified in the LCR study. If any deficiencies are identified, the CAISO will offer a CPE and its LSEs an opportunity to cure the deficiency per section 40.7. Next slide. The CAISO has discretion to determine if additional capacity is needed to fulfill any remaining identified needs after the secure period. The CAISO will first designate an individual deficiency in a local capacity area and allocate costs proportionally to all deficient LSCs and CTEs vis-a-vis their obligation in the TAC area. That includes the deficient area and or sub-area. Any remaining local capacity deficiency in the year ahead timeframe will be filled through a collective local CPM and allocated pro rata to all LSCs with load in the respective TAC area. Next slide. Since under the current construct, a CPE is not assigned a load share, it would not be allocated CPM costs associated with a collective local CPM, system CPM, significant event, or traditional dispatch CPMs, whose cost allocation are based on that pro rata load share. In the future, were an LRA to assign a CPE a system or flex RA obligation, the CAISO would have to open a separate stakeholder process to consider additional tariff modifications. So right now, the tariff systems are designed around the CPE only procuring local RA. And if an LRA were to expand the CPE's procurement role, the CAISO would have to do subsequent tariff and system changes to accommodate that expanded role. Next slide. So because the CPUC adopted a hybrid procurement framework where the CPE will first be assigned the entire local obligation for their represented TAC area, LSCs are given the opportunity to self-show a resource to the CPE as part of their solicitation process in order to retain the entire system and flex attributes of that resource and help lower or help fulfill the CPE's procurement targets. And so in this process, there's been a discussion around how the backstop risk should be shared between the CPE and these entities that agree to self-show. And so as a general principle, the CPE cost allocation for an individual local RA deficiency will follow the entity assigned the local obligation by the LRA. And so CPM backstop costs will be allocated according to how the LRA apportions the local capacity obligation upfront. So if the CPUC assigns the entire obligation to the CPEs as specified in Decision 2006-002, then the CPE will carry the entire risk of backstop costs related to individual local CPM designations. Next slide. In the recent CPUC-PD in Proceeding 2110-002, it was ordered that the following requirements are adopted for non-performance of shelf-shown local resources. So if the CAISO makes a CPM designation, the central procurement entity shall be charged any associated CAISO backstop procurement costs, including for the non-performance of self-shown resources. The CPUC then provides guidance on how the CPE will allocate the CPM costs to the LLCs under different reasons for failure to self-show the resource. And so the CAISO believes that its final proposal is compatible with the Commission's proposed order, and no further modifications are necessary to accommodate the hybrid procurement framework. Next slide. So currently, only LSCs can receive RA credits from the applicable CPM procured resources, and LRAs are allowed to determine whether these credits should be allowed to count towards the RA requirements adopted by the LRA. The CAISO proposes to modify this rule to allow CPEs to receive RA credits from CPM procured resources associated with the LSCs they are representing. The CAISO proposes to allow the LRA to reallocate these credits as they see fit amongst its CTEs and LSCs in the same way that it can reallocate RMR credits among their jurisdictional entities today. Next slide. For resources that the CAISO deems as reliability must-run units, the CAISO allocates the cost of these resources to LLCs proportional to their load share in each applicable TAC area. And so the CAISO does not propose any modifications to the cost allocation methodology for RMR to account for the CPE, and will continue to allocate costs directly to LSEs. The CAISO will continue to give the CPUC the RMR credits to allocate towards jurisdictional LSEs or CPEs, and the CPUC can decide if it would like to allocate the local attributes of the resource, the CPE, and the system flex attributes to LSEs, and the CAISO will accept this allocation. Next slide. So the CAISO has received mixed feedback on its proposal to include the CPE into our existing CPM processes. So CDWR and FCE were generally supportive of the CAISO proposal. CalCCA does not oppose the CAISO proposal and advocated that the CPE should receive the CPM cost allocation for both individual and collective deficiencies. However, the CAISO has not changed its proposal and will continue to allocate collective local deficiencies to LSEs on a pro rata basis. The thought here is that, again, the CPE is just a procurement entity and would likely just reallocate the cost of a collective deficiency. And so in order to cut out the middleman, the CAISO thinks it's prudent just to maintain the current tariff and system status quo by, again, assigning the collective deficiencies on a pro rata basis. Middle River Power commented that only to the extent that the CPE's reallocation of CPM costs to its LSEs uses a different methodology than the pro rata basis used by the CAISO, doesn't make sense to allocate costs directly to the CPE. And so in order to allow the CPUC sufficient flexibility to administer the hybrid program and to maintain cost-saving principles of the ISO, the CAISO will continue to allocate costs to the entity assigned local obligation by the LRA. And so to the extent that the CPUC continues to allocate the entire local obligation to the CPE, then the CPE will get the backstop costs. And as in the PD that was released by the CPUC a couple days ago, again, they do provide different cost allocation methodologies based on the reason for an entity's failure to self-share the resource. And so in order to allow the CPUC to have that flexibility to have different cost allocations based on the reason for the failure to self-show, the CAISO thinks it's prudent to maintain its proposal. Okay, I have one more slide and then we'll pause for questions. So next slide. PG&E reiterated their comments on the SHA proposal, where they offered an alternate proposal for CPM cost allocation of local RA deficiencies. They suggested the CAISO modify its tariffs to allow the LRA to determine their own cost allocation methodology for individual local deficiencies, and the CAISO would have a default provision. Again, the CAISO continues not to support this proposal because it could break cost allocation principles, and that the CPUC could assign costs to an entity that was not responsible for meeting that local RA obligation up front. And so if the CPUC wants the cost assigned to a different entity other than the CPE, then the CPUC would need to allocate the local requirements to that entity prior to showing at the CAISO and not after the fact. And then the proposed order continues to direct the CAISO to allocate CPM costs directly to the CPE. And so we think the Commission is pretty clear on who they want the cost allocated to, and we think that the CAISO's proposal fits with the spirit of that order, and again, maintains cost allocation principles at the ISO. So with that, I will pause for questions.
All right, we do have one question on the line. When your line is unmuted, you may go ahead.
Hi, my name is Wen. I'm with STE. So, Bridget, I just want to make sure I fully understand. It sounds like for any sort of CPM cost allocation, CAISO's proposal is that for individual deficiencies of any kind in the TAC area, it will be the cost of that CPM will be assigned to the CPE, and then CAISO's proposal that CPE will have to figure out how to reassign that cost to any LSCs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, but then for collective deficiencies, that will be assigned pro rata, and that will bypass the CPE altogether.
Correct.
Okay, got it. And for just one more question. So for the individual deficiencies, it doesn't matter what the reason is, whether it's, plant outages or whether it's, other reasons. It doesn't matter what the reason is, it's all coming back to the CPE.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question. I think it was a little bit earlier. I think maybe around slide 20 or 22 or somewhere. I think the CAISO had said that the LSCs that show system, they have to show the same amount as local, or the same amount as local needs to be recognized as the credit. Is that correct?
So what this slide is trying to get at is the Commission is going to use credits to allocate out the system select attributes of the procured local resource. So say you procured a 100 megawatt local resource, so you have 100 megawatts of system attributes. And so when the CAISO gets the credit that says, okay, for this 100 megawatt local resource, LSC A gets 20 megawatts, LSC 2 gets 80 megawatts. And so the CAISO just wants to make sure that and then it'll validate against the CPE showing that 100 megawatt resource. We just want to make sure that the credits that are being assigned to entities match with what resources are actually being shown. So you don't get an instance where, we expected the CPE to show the 100 megawatt resource, but for some reason it only showed 80, then our systems would kind of lower the credits to match that 80 megawatts that was actually shown. So it's just sort of a check to make sure that the credits are sort of neutral and that the LRA is only assigning out credits for resources that were actually shown to the CAISO. So we don't have sort of a, crediting resources that don't actually show up on the supply plan.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you, Bridget.
Mm-hmm.
All right, there are currently no additional questions in the queue.
Okay, so this wraps up the CPE implementation section. So again, we can pause again at the end of the call to see if there are any remaining questions on CPE that folks think about. But if not, then we can hand it over to James Lynn to cover the range settlement modification section. Thanks, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'm going to apologize. I have construction going on in the background, so if you hear some banging, that's what it is. But yeah, today we're going to cover the range settlement modifications that are being proposed in relationship to this initiative. Go to the next slide. In the previous discussions, we were asked to provide an example or some more information as to what is the issue. So what I'm going to start with is the background of what range settlement process is, and then we have identified an example that will demonstrate the issue, and then what the overall proposal is and the solution. So basically the background for the RAIN process is RAIN consists of a system of non-availability charges as well as availability incentive payments. These charges and incentive payments are designed to provide RA resources with the incentives to meet their real-time must-offer obligation. These charges and credits are determined for each RA resource based upon an assessment of how they performed or how they participated in the market by bidding in to the day-ahead and real-time market. If the resource falls below 94.5% of the must-offer obligation, the ISO will assess the non-availability charge over the month, and then if it exceeds the 98.5%, they will be eligible to receive an incentive payment if we collected any charges from those that did not meet their obligation. Any resources that fall in between these two areas are not going to receive a charge or a payment. Now, I said that it's assessed on a daily basis. This daily assessment is then carried over to the end of the month. And so that each daily input has an input into the monthly assessment of the 94.5 and the 98.5%. Can you go to the next slide? There's a limit placed on the amount of availability incentive payments that can be allocated in any month, but not on the amount of availability charges. The incentive payment is 3 times the rain penalty price. And so if I've collected anything over that 3 times, then that current methodology has any excess of it being carried over from month to month and distributed as incentive payments in subsequent months, or distributed out at the end of the year to meter demand if it's a generic RA obligation, or if it's LSEs if it's a flex RA obligation. So if we can go to the next slide. So what this carryover mechanism has caused is a settlement process challenges. The mechanism has created several challenges that have required the ISO to file waivers with FERC in order to not assess the payouts or the year-end allocation to meet our obligations. The carry-forward mechanism creates a financial issue when the settlement recalculation determines that the RA resource is due a refund or reduction in rain charges. Now, this could come through the form of dispute. It could come through the form of payload corrections or price corrections, anything that requires that the inputs into the rain penalty calculations are changed between one settlement statement or another, creates a financial issue for the ISO. The only possible source to fund this refund at times is the pool of penalties distributed in subsequent months or at the year end. So what this means is any of these, if I have a change in a month and any of the dollars are carried over to subsequent months or even to the end of the year, then the changes in that month will have to wait until I get as a market clearing entity, I have to wait until I get to that subsequent month in order to collect the funds to pay for the changes in the prior months. And this is where we'll go into the example. Can you please go to the next slide? Okay, so figure 1, and this is an example. If we do an initial statement, this is just setting the baseline. And I chose along with Middle River Power, we kind of developed a time frame which we wanted to put this example together. But we chose July of 2020 through December of 2020. And we have broken it down into generic RA and CPM penalties and payments, as well as flex RA and CPM penalties and payments. In July, the resulting generic settlement showed that we had a carryover of $873,000 that gets carried over into August. In August, now my non-availability charges was about $2 million, but I was able to allocate out an additional $200,000 from the prior month. So now that means I have a carryover that went from $873,000 down to $629,000. However, September, October, November, and December, instead of having excess funds to allocate out in these subsequent months, I actually increased the carryover amount all the way up to the point we're at $9.9 million that gets carried forward to the end of the year. And at that end of the year, based upon the tariff, we are allocating that to meter demand. Sorry, that's my dog. but I did not have that issue with flexible RA. Flexible RA, I was able to allocate it all out throughout the year. And so from the table below, this is what the invoice from a market clearing perspective looks like. I have this how much RAIM assessment charges collected, and then this is the amount of RAIM incentive payments that were allocated out. And the following is a balance account. This is a trust account that we hold the funds in to be distributed as the time horizon allows us. So if we go to figure 2, which is on the next slide, I'm making the assumption that there was some type of change between the recalculation or the initial statement and the recalculation statement that caused us to give a credit back of the assessment charges of $445,000. Now, you can see that in July, that means our carryover amount was reduced from $873,000 to $428,000. However, when we carried over to August, because I still have additional funds that were collected and not fully allocated out, not all of our money is allocated out. It just keeps on carrying forward. It goes to $184,000, then $523,000, all the way up to the point where I have $9.5 million to allocate out to measure demand. And from a market clearing perspective, if the bottom table shows, is that when I had this correction done, I paid out the money to the appropriate generators at $445,000. That means my net invoicing or market clearing, I have a reduction in the market clearing of $445,000. So that means I don't get to carry as much over. I don't have any changes in August through December because the amount of funds available meets the assessment for that period, and there was no subsequent invoice changes. However, so at the year end, when I allocated out these excess funds to meter demand, this is the party I have to collect it from in order to fund that July 2020 adjustment. So what you can see here, there's a 7-month carryover in which the ISO has to carry these funds. So if we go to the next slide, this is a restatement of what I was just talking about. And so if we compare the settlement invoices of RAIM charges and payments between the initial and recalculation settlement statement, indicates that the RAIM obligation for July 2020, due to dispute, because as I said, this is just an example, but it could be data correction, it could be price correction, results in the ISO having to fund the $445,000 net invoice change for 7 months. This 7-month fund period, because the $445,000 needs to be collected from the people or the parties that we allocated it out to. And so that would be the meter demand. And so I have to wait till I do my allocation of the year end to recollect that money in order to fund what was changed in July. So that means the ISO has to carry those funds. Next slide. So before I go on this, is there any questions on the issue or the example that has been provided? Can we go back one, please? I
do not see any questions in the queue.
Okay. No questions, so then we will move forward. So the RAIM settlement modification proposal, what we're proposing to do is to modify the current RAIM settlement process to eliminate the rule that unavailable charges assessed in excess of a monthly cap will roll over to funds for future months. Rather than rolling over, the ISO proposes to allocate these excess funds based upon the activity in that trading month, according to measured demand, so meter demand. So basically, we are going to, if you are participating in that month, your load would receive the allocation, and we're going to, instead of having it to a distinction between meter demand versus our LSD obligation, we're proposing to allocate it all to meter demand. Next slide. So if we go back to that original example and we walk through how this will work, there was questions as to whether or not this proposal was going to continue to have the same issues. But if you can see in July 2020, if I have my God, it's going to use words. So if I do the allocation correctly, I'm going to have the assessment of charges of $3 million. I'm going to have an incentive payment of $2.1 million. Well, that leaves us an excess of $873,000. So instead of carrying that forward to subsequent months, instead we are going to allocate that $873,000 out to the measured demand within that period. And so then from a month-by-month perspective, the market clearing invoices are neutral. I have everything I've collected meets everything I've allocated out, so I don't have any neutrality issues, and therefore I don't have to have additional funding responsibility. If we go to Figure 4, which is the next slide, this demonstrates what happens when I make a modification. As you can see, in July, I used the same $445,000 change. Only thing that's changed between what the allocation are out is in the net monthly distribution to meter demand. It went from $800,000 down to $428,000. So in this case, what happens is I paid out to the generator, I paid them back for that refund, and then I collected from meter demand within the same month, so we don't have the issue of carrying over from one month to another and having to fund that carryover. Can we go to the next slide? So the settlement example demonstrates what we're proposing the changes to be. The ISO settlement system will allocate any excess funds to, and it should be meter demand, not measure demand, I apologize for that, in the month in which the excess occurred. Figure 3 and Figure 4 demonstrate the settlement charges and payments for the trade period of July 2020 and 2021 and how they remain neutral. Figure 4 also highlights the settlement of the RAIN charges and payments when a participant's RA obligation changes from initial statement and how that remains neutral. And basically what this proposal is doing is the RA obligation becomes isolated to that month in which the obligation exchange occurs, and there is no carryover to future periods. So we are isolating the collection and the payment out or the distribution of that collection to generators and then to meter load within that month. So that means that when I have an adjustment of $445,000 to the generator, I'm going to collect it from the meter demand that it was had been paid out to. Okay, next slide. Now, we see as the range settlement modification proposal benefits are, is one, it eliminates the monthly rollover, ensures that the resettlement issues that we have experienced that necessitated the CalISO's April 10th, 2020 waiver filing will not occur. We don't have to keep asking for a waiver. We are meeting FERC's request to ensure that that doesn't occur again. Allocating excess funds based upon meter demand will simplify the calculation. Allocating the excess funds to Meter demand, LSEs will be compensated for resources that did not perform in accordance with your RA contract obligations. And this will address the burden of the ISO's reserve account to ensure that the range settlement charges and credits all take place in the same month in which they occur and not having to go to subsequent months. Next slide. Okay, we'll start stakeholders' comments in a second, but I wanted to see if anybody had any questions. I think there's one.
Yes, we do have a question in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, James. This is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Can you hear me?
Hi, Noah. How are you today?
Good. How about yourself?
Pretty good.
So, quick question on a couple of these slides here, but maybe going through figures 3 and 4. Can you explain on the resettlement calculation whether or not that amount of money in the initial settlement statement was already given out, sort of divvied out to either generators for the payment as well as being taken away from generators for the charges?
Sure. So if we can go back, I think it's 3 slides. Couple more. One more. Figure 3. So I'm happy you asked that question, Noah, because I want to make this clear is we are still trying to meet the intent of the RAIN, where we're trying to incentivize generation to meet their real-time must-off obligation. And this incentive mechanism is a 2-tier, or I call it a 2-tier incentive. You penalize those that don't perform, and then you compensate or provide extra incentive for those that did. Now, that extra incentive is based upon the collection of money from those that did not perform. So what will happen is when we do the assessment on the initial statement here, I'll do the assessment for those RA resources that were supposed to meet their real-time must-off obligation, and they fall below that 94.5%. I'm going to collect money from them. So then now I have this pool of money, and now I have to go and allocate it out. Step 1 is in alignment with this policy is to make sure that the generators get it first. So we are going to take that those generators that performed above that 98.5% and then allocate these funds to them at 3 times the RAIN penalty price. And we will fully fund them first, and then anything left over is going to be then allocated up to meter demand. So when I go into figure 4, which is on the next slide, this is all happening within that month of July. And so when I have a change and my non-availability charges being assessed was reduced by $445,000, I'm still going to make sure that the generators receive that incentive payment first. And then anything which I had originally allocated out to meter demand, I'm now going to take back as a charge to meter demand. So from an invoicing statement-wise, you'll see that there's $428,000 that will be what the current, we call it the current amount, but when the invoicing it says it'll be, I compare it to what I did in the initial, and it'll be a charge back to meter demand for $445,000 because I paid out to that generator with the new assessment of $445,000. Does that help?
Well, maybe on the question of, the problem at hand, in the first filing, it's not really a resettlement within the same month. We're talking about resettlement of many months after sort of July, 2020, as an example, right?
Yeah, that was figures 1 and 2. So in that FERC filing, because I had that change in July 2020, and those 445 that money was carried forward all the way to year end, I have to fund that money until I resettle the year end. And that's from a market clearing perspective.
Yeah, I guess I think the question then for me is whether or not it seems like the reason you have to carry the money is because you have no net change, or what you explained that there's no net change from month to month, even in the resettlement or calculation invoice, and that seems to be a limitation on how potentially the ISO views the resettlement distribution relative to sort of an incentive payment portion.
Okay. So you're correct in the sense that the net change from month to month, from August through December, from market clearing perspective, it did not change. The only place that it changed was the excess funds, and and therefore that's why we had to carry it forward, or in essence fund that for 7 months. And our proposal is designed to ensure that when you don't have a net change, even if you don't have a net change from August to December, there is no impact on the clearing in the market, because you have allocated this out to meter demand like you did at the year end, and you're pulling it back from meter demand in the same way, but instead of doing it year end, you're doing it within the month.
Yeah, I think in our minds is if the ISO is capable of sort of redefining how the payments would go out for resettlement prior to the incentive payment, this seems like you can solve that problem if you look at sort of August 2020 here in your example. There you show no monthly distributions because charges equal payments. If there is a resettlement at some point in this particular month without any distributions, how do you then carry forward to the next month, or do you just charge it back to me, or who do you charge, I guess, in August 2020?
August 2020, it would be, we would pull it back from the generators that receive the incentive payment, because RAIN is it's a fully funding mechanism. I need to collect from the bad participants in order to provide it the additional, and this is an additional incentive payment to generators, and not something that needs to be funded by meter demand.
Right. You said it's it's additional incentive payment, and I think maybe that's where the definition of incentive versus a recalculation of the settlement statements go. I think it would be. I think we just have a different view on, a recalculation is not an incentive. There's nothing sort of earned.
Recalculation the recalculation means is just that we are resettling that same trade period based upon the information that is there, and that we're given new information. It does not go into what constitutes the RAIN mechanism itself. And the reason why I use the word it's an additional incentive payment is actually from the original draft final proposal. It's, the availability incentive mechanism increases reliability by rewarding high-performing resources and penalizing low-performing resources, reducing gaming, and increasing standardization of RA contracts. That was one of the main purposes of this initiative, and we were trying to maintain that.
Yeah, but here's the thing, right? In your figure 3, you have non-availability charges in July 2020 of $3 million. And then now you're in the resettlement calculation, you have 2.6 million. And so it's less of a charge to which you need to give back, but that's not a incentive to the generator that you sort of made this calculation, right?
Okay, no.
Because the incentive payments didn't change.
Okay, no, I hear you, but you're trying to change the fundamental principle of the RAIN incentive mechanism as well. The RAIN incentive mechanism is supposed to be a monthly encompassing mechanism where those funds which we have collected, they fund the incentive payment out. And I hear you, and I'm just trying to maintain the original RAIN incentive principles with the fact that it's supposed to be, the incentive is supposed to be fully funded from those RAIN assessment charges.
Sure, and I think you do that, and you can still do that with a year-end rollover or a monthly rollover that gets divvied out at the end of the year, rather than do it on a monthly basis. Essentially, if you're changing the resettlement of the charges within the same month, you should be able to take it away, in a sense, from the rollover for the next month, because it's essentially the next month hasn't occurred yet. This is a restatement. It makes. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying. So, can we move back to Figure 2? And this is what I believe you're addressing. I think that's 3 more slides back. There you go. So this is the one that you're trying to address. Is based on the discussion we had previously. July we had $445,000 change. Okay. When I go and allocate out in August, the assessment charges that we are collecting does not change. I still have $200 million collected from generic. I have $740,000 collected from collect, allocated out. We allocated out the $2 million. Everything that we collected in that month, but we pulled some money from the previous month. And this is what the current mechanism does. So what happens is I'm paying out more than I collected that month, and therefore I am not able to, once I make a change in a prior month, as long as I'm going to pay out at least what we have or more, I can't not collect any money to pay back what I did in July.
Yeah,
and that is what's causing the problem.
Right. I understand. I think this is why we suggested the ISO prior. So from a market clearing, yeah, and I'll address that statement in your comments, and so if we want to move on, and we can talk about those there, or I can address it now. So basically, you're asking me to do, yeah, okay, either way, it's a discussion. You're asking for FIFO, first in, first out. But even if I did first in, first out, from a market clearing perspective, as a market, I am short. I'm not collecting the $445,000 because nothing changed. And you pointed out several times, nothing changed August, September, October, November, December. So therefore, from a clearing perspective, I have to wait until I get to the year-end distribution in order to collect that money back. And so, even if I prioritize and say, yes, this carryover goes first, August still has more money in it than I've collected. So therefore, I have to wait until I collect more money.
Yeah. So I would say that if the ISO's interpretation, if the ISO's interpretation of the sort of the 445,000 here on the resettlement is an incentive payment, then it should be able to
put it into the August initial or resettlement. I think I'm getting a little bit here on the payment side, and so to sort of max out the total amount of, still at 2.28 million, but that's inclusive of the 445,000 that needs to be paid out first. Because that's your definition of the resettlement is an incentive payment, then it should be that should go into the calculation.
So when it comes to allocating in August, I have a total of, in this case, $2.4 million. Okay, if I'm capping it $2.2 million, it doesn't matter if the funds were from the carryover first or from what was collected. I have more money than I've collected, than I can pay out. So therefore, I have to wait until I have a situation where I actually collect more than I can pay. So I see a change. So that's why the ISO is having to fund the $445,000. Remember, the incentive payment is based upon what we collected in that from the RAIN assessment charges in that month. And right now, it has a carryover, but it's got a cap on what can be paid out of 3 times of the RAIN penalty price to the good players. It is not the good performers are guaranteed that 3 times. It is you are going to get paid out what we collected up to 3 times.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to prolong this, but my final point is that the rollover which caused you to be able to pay out more than what you collected is an incorrect number because of the resettlement, and therefore, if you view that you want to hold the generous whole as 3x, that value isn't correct to begin with, right? Because you actually have $445,000 less from the rollover.
So
right?
the key phrase to that is, in my opinion, what you're saying is to hold the generators to 3x. There is no this mechanism isn't intended to hold the generators at 3x. This mechanism is designed to pay out up to 3x. There's a slight difference there.
Okay.
That's why I kept on saying, or kept on trying to reiterate, that we take what was collected and then we allocate out. If that allocation out is less than 3x, you are not necessarily, let's say this is January, you're not expected to get additional money to bring you up to 3x.
Correct.
That is part of the
fully agree with you.
But that's exactly what, so I'm not trying to hold you at 3x. That's not the intent of the RAIN incentive payment.
Sure. I think we're saying the same thing on the 3x. I just view that if the resettlement causes you to have a change on the rollover amount, then the original rollover amount that you carry forward, thinking that you can pay up to the 3x, is incorrect. Then you should correct the rollover amount first. So, okay. Thanks so much.
I hear you. Thank you, Noah. Appreciate the discussion. So if we can go down to the stakeholder comments, which is, go back 1. Okay, so currently the ISO received supportive comments from Cal, CCA, PG&E, and FCE for these proposed changes. PG&E strongly supports the elimination of the RAIN carryover mechanism and believes the ISO is well justified to move to a more simplified and fair process for distributing the excess rain charges. CDWR did not object. We can go to the next slide. Now, Middle River Power, and you'll hear Noah and I had a lot of these discussions just a few seconds ago, is opposed to this policy change and argues that the ISO has not clearly articulated why its proposal is better than any other alternatives to solve the problem. Middle River Power understands an identified issue to be, and if there's a refund obligation that arises when there is insufficient unallocated rain penalty funds to pay the generator, but do not understand why the ISO is unable to prioritize the funds to be paid out of the surplus rain penalty rollovers because of neutrality rules within the tariff. And so the ISO has provided illustrative examples of the settlement issue and how the proposal will address this issue in additional clarity, as well as we've had our discussions. Next slide. Middle River Power believes this proposal will create fewer incentives for resources to maintain reliability in the long run because there's may not be sufficient funds to pay 3 times the incentive cap. And the key phrase to that is the incentive cap. It's not intended to always pay out 3 times the rain penalty price. And Middle River Power advocates that the ISOs use penalty funds collected in the month along with any rollover rain surpluses to pay out a refund before paying out the incentive payments as an alternative to the ISO's proposal of eliminating monthly rollover. ISO appreciates Middle River Power's suggestion. However, Figure 1 and Figure 2 demonstrate that even if the ISO adopts the FIFO, or first in, first out methodology, the ISO's clearing of the market would still require the ISO to fund the rain obligation changes between July 20th to year end. So that means that the ISO, based on that example, would still have to fund that $445,000 for a 7-month period. Next slide. Okay. Any additional questions?
I do not see any questions in the queue.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Noah for all the good discussions here, and I'm going to hand this over to Bridget to handle the EIM governing body rule.
Thanks, James. So if you go to the next slide. So this initiative falls outside the EIM governing body's joint authority role. So none of the tariff rule changes currently contemplated in this initiative would be applicable to EIM entities, balancing authority areas, EIM entities, or other market participants within the EIM entity balancing authority area in their capacity as participants in the EIM. And so the proposed tariff rules would be applicable only to CAISO balancing authority area or to the CAISO control grid. Therefore, the scope of this initiative falls outside the scope of joint authority. Next slide. This initiative also falls outside the scope of the EIM governing body's advisory role. So the EIM governing body may provide advisory input of a proposal to change or establish tariff rules that would apply to the real-time market, but are not within the scope of joint authority. And so no aspect of this initiative would apply or impact the real-time market. Therefore, this initiative also falls outside the EIM governing body's advisory role. And so far, stakeholder comments are generally supportive of this EIM governing body classification, and no objections were raised. On the final proposal, there's an opportunity to comment to sort of dispute this classification, and so stakeholders haven't seen the final proposal. If they disagree with the CAISO's interpretation of the governing body's role, please submit those in your comments. So any questions on the EIM governing body's role?
I do not see any questions in queue.
Okay. And then are there any final questions on the CPE or RAIN before we wrap up? just give folks another minute to kind of think if they have any other questions before we wrap this up today.
All right, I do not see any additional questions in queue, but as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question via WebEx audio, be sure to click on the raise hand icon above the chat panel to enter the queue. And if you are on the regular phone line, press #2 on your keypad to be entered into the queue. All right, I do not see any additional questions.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your participation today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ellie to go over next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Next slide, please. As a reminder, comments on the revised draft tariff language are due by end of day today, February 15th, and comments on the final proposal are due by end of day March 1st. Please use the comment template on the initiative webpage to submit your comments. Next slide.
And that was the final slide.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. We look forward to receiving your comments and have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.